Hello, and thanks for checking out another video. Today, I'm giving my review and thoughts on Malcolm Gladwell's latest book, Revenge of the Tipping Point. So, this is the follow up to Gladwell's aptly previously titled book, The Tipping Point, which is the classic 20 plus year old book now, if you can believe that, about how things reach a saturation point and the changes that come once you reach that point. So in the book, and I think this is an example from the previous book, or at least his podcast, the classic example is boardrooms. When a board is, for example, 10 members and there's only one female on an otherwise all male board, the female's voice is not heard and she's not taken seriously. However, the tipping point comes when, in this example, when 30% of the board, so 3 out of 10 are females and the rest males, then that collective group does have a voice. And that's the tipping point when change occurs. And he goes in this book as well, and he briefly talks about diversity. So how a group, becomes predominantly white, and then when 30% of another race comes in and ethnicity, then that reaches a tipping point and changes the culture. And his first example of the book that I found personally really interesting was Overstories in Miami, and how years ago, if you were a white American who moved to Miami, it seemed like any other town. However, the culture slowly shifted as more Hispanics and Latinos came to settle in Miami, due, of course, to its proximity to Cuba and other factors. It developed this overstory, this culture that's totally different from the rest of the United States, and it developed its own culture. One of the examples he uses is a cop giving a traffic ticket, and the cop will just literally tell the person getting the ticket, no, don't go to the court, talk to this guy, and he'll get it reduced and just, take care of things for you for much less than the hassle of going to the actual courthouse. And you may think, what is this lawless part of America? But it's just the culture has changed so much due to reaching the tipping point. And again, as the title mentions about pandemics or epidemics and social engineering, this changes the makeup of the area through the overstory that begins developing. And he later ties this theme of Miami to later about Medicare fraud, which he comes back to later in the book. And which is, again, very interesting, myself being a Floridian. So these stories maybe had a little personal touch here as well. And how Miami and South Florida in particular is such a hotbed of Medicare fraud. And he backs this up in his investigative journalist style, where he has interviews. You get to go like a ride along as FBI agents investigate some of these pop-up businesses that only exist as a front to Medicare fraud, and just how the culture of the area has let this happen. They could be so blatantly obvious that it's a office building with these literal pop-ups, and the people staffing there have no idea why they're even there. They just exist to have a physical address for the Medicare fraud. It's all very interesting, and it's done in Gladwell's style, where he presents the case and sort of makes you draw your own conclusions, which is what I personally liked about the story. He's not hitting you over the head. Well, you might argue that he is hitting you over your head because, of course, he's presenting it how he wants to present the information, but he isn't telling you this is why or whether it's good or bad. He's just laying out the facts and letting you, of course, come to the conclusion that, yes, something is wrong and it probably needs to get cleaned up. So this Medicare fraud, and how can it be so blatantly obvious? And he connects this through a number of different stories, stressing his points of how things spread, how things reach a tipping point. Some other standout stories that I personally resonated with was the idea of monocultures. Again, this is the idea of sort of the tipping point, or the reverse of the tipping point, when it's so monoculture and there is no diversity, how bad things can happen. He illustrates this in two examples, one being cheetahs and how the cheetah population gets ravaged by diseases because there's no diversity, and eventually how the zoo solved this was by introducing a foreign cousin species and letting the cheetahs breed with their close cousins to introduce some genetic diversity into the gene pool. And of course, what hit home was the monoculture of this town, this fictional town called Poplar Grove, which ends up having a suicide epidemic. And it's very disheartening. Any parent listening to this who has kids in school might know similar situations where the town is developed into such a way that the community is a monoculture. They only want the top performing kids, the top performing students in this culture. And while everything is the best of the best students, academically on paper, what introduced by having everyone the same and being such a monoculture is that a suicide happened and then it started spreading like an epidemic. And first it was one, then it was two, then it was three, and it became this hidden secret in this town that on paper is best in the nation at sports and academics, but the high pressure environment created through the monoculture led to this suicide epidemic flourishing in this community. So all in all, it's a very interesting read or listen. And on that point, I highly recommend the audiobook for this one. Gladwell has had a podcast for many years now, and it really shows in the audiobook. So Gladwell narrates the book. And in addition to the narration, he has audio sort of background music. When someone is interviewed, like he does the opioid epidemic, and he has the Sackler interviews, when they're interviewed, they play the audio from those interviews. You're given, insights, and anytime someone's interviewed that he has audio for, you listen to it, you hear the different voices. So it makes it a very compelling and engaging listen while I was listening to him explain the tipping point, all these different sub-stories that happened throughout this. And lastly, kind of connected to the monoculture story of schools, anyone who's a parent who is getting ready for college or has a kid in college, or just in general, may be aware of the college admissions scandal. And Gladwell does touch upon this. And it was really eye-opening to me as well that colleges, specifically he calls out Harvard and Ivy Leagues, how they use sports as a segregator. And you listen to it, it seems obvious now, but I should have made that connection earlier, or maybe I should have read into it more than just these headlines. But the interesting part about this of using sports as a segregator, he interviews again, listen to this tennis star, and the type of person who can commit themselves in high school to have a private tennis coach, to travel to all these games, to have a parent that can take them to these practices, to these travel games, and to go to a school that can accommodate this travel schedule. So probably a private school. When you think about all these things of what it takes to be, top in the state at tennis, it's obviously someone who is well-to-do, well-off. Unfortunately, this is probably not a first-generation college student that can afford the time and effort required by not just the student, but the family to achieve this level of sports success. So that, again, is the type of person that, upper middle class that would go to an Ivy League school. So by connecting these dots, that's what, Ivy League schools can use as a differentiator to using sports as a differentiator to the people that can excel at these sports that require a little more financial commitment. Those are the type of sports that these Ivy Leagues use, like rowing, rugby, tennis, not the easy to access pickup game sports like soccer or basketball. Ivy Leagues use these elite quote unquote sports as a segregator, and then they take the top of the class at these sports because those are the families that are financially well off and fit the mold of the Ivy League student. So all in all, it's a really interesting read, and again, a really interesting listen. The audiobook being so engaging, being so well produced. I would give this probably a 4.5 out of 5. Again, not the best of the best book I've ever read, but really highly engaging, and it really makes you think. Gladwell clearly put a lot of work in the book and in the production of the book. So it's definitely worth a listen, worth an Audible credit, and definitely worth a Libby hold if you can get it in your library. So that's my thoughts and review on Malcolm Gladwell's latest book, Revenge of the Tipping Point. Thanks for watching.